what is it that determines whether a habit is good or bad? We use these phrases a lot of the time in conversation. We say, oh, it's a bad habit, it's a good habit. And sometimes people will ask me like, well, why do I repeat this habit if it's bad for me? If it's so terrible, then how come I keep coming back to it? And broadly speaking, we could lump it into an immediate bucket, an immediate outcome, and an ultimate outcome. And what you find is that for most bad habits, the immediate outcome is actually pretty favorable. Like, the classic example is smoking a cigarette. But if you smoke a cigarette outside the office at 10 a.m. with a friend, well, then immediately you get some socialization. Maybe it curbs your nicotine craving or just lets you de-stress for a couple minutes or get a break from work. There are all kinds of things that you might be benefiting from. It's only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that the ultimate outcome is negative. With the good habits, especially the first time you perform them, it's often the reverse. Like the first week of training in the gym, your body looks the same in the mirror, you're sore, you don't really have much to show for the effort that you're putting in. You feel kind of stupid in there. You're wondering if people judge you or if you're doing it the wrong way. There are a lot of upfront costs, and it's only 2 or 5 or 10 years later that you get the outcome that you're looking for. And so in a sense, the cost of your good habits is in the present. The cost of your bad habits is in the future. And that misalignment between when you feel rewarded and when you feel punished helps to explain why we tend to fall pretty easily into a lot of things that we would categorize as bad, like eating donuts or smoking a cigarette or whatever, and fall less easily into things that we would categorize as good and so it's unlikely that you rectify that quickly. And this is a phenomenon that I think is so critical or so important to behavior change. I called it the cardinal rule of behavior change in Atomic Habits, which is behaviors that get immediately rewarded get repeated. Behaviors that get immediately punished get avoided. Goals are not the primary thing that drives results. And in fact, if you look at the performance in most domains, the winners and the losers have the same goal. Presumably every Formula One driver has the goal of winning the race when they take off from the starting line. If you have a job opening and 100 candidates apply for the job, presumably every candidate has the goal of getting the job. So the goal is not the thing that makes the difference in the performance. And if the winners and the losers have the same goal, then it cannot be the distinguishing factor. Maybe it's necessary. Perhaps there's an argument it's necessary for success, but it's not sufficient for it. And so that got me thinking more like, well, what is it then that drives it? And in the book, the way that I describe is the difference between systems and goals. And so, your goal is your desired outcome, your target, the thing you're shooting for. Your system is the collection of daily habits that you follow. It's like all these little gears in this overall machine. And if there's ever a gap between your desired outcome and your daily habits, if there's ever a gap between your goal and your system, your daily habits will always win, right? I'll adjust the habits. Let's get this machine running in a more fluid fashion. And you'll find that the results kind of come naturally.
So you talk about 3 different types of change, right? There's sort of the outcome change, the process change. We've touched on a little bit of those. But the one we haven't really touched on is this identity change. And that was something that when I read your book really resonated because it provided, I think, a very decent explanation, at least for why exercise comes naturally to me, which is it's so hardwired into my identity, and why maybe certain other habits I've tried to create over time don't come easily to me because I haven't fully identified with them yet. So explain a little bit first of all, expand on that, but also how you kind of came to realize that.
Part of the reason I started thinking about it is I started asking, why do habits really matter? Why do we seem to care about them a lot as a society? It's something a lot of books get written about, something we talk about a lot. There's clearly some kind of deeper importance to them. So what is it? And the surface level answer is that we care about habits because they get us these external things that make us more productive and more fit and so on. And habits can help you do all of that stuff, which is great. But I think the real reason, the deeper reason that habits matter is that they are a signal internally to ourselves about who we are and what we care about. And, they're kind of a signal of like the story that we're telling ourselves. So in a sense, every time that you perform a habit, you are embodying a particular identity. Like when you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who is clean and organized. And so your habits provide evidence. They provide proof of the story that you're telling yourself. And that, I think, is a very powerful thing, a very deep, personal thing that habits can provide, and perhaps the real reason why they matter. So to come back to your question about process versus outcome versus identity and kind of how we change, usually when people set out to make some kind of change, they start by thinking about the results or the outcome that they want. So they say, I want to lose 40 pounds in the next 6 months. And then from that outcome, they back into a process or a plan. So they say, all right, if I want to lose 40 pounds, then I need to follow this nutrition plan. I'm going to need to work out 4 days a week. And maybe there are details to those plans and everything. But what if instead we said, who is the type of person I wish to be? What is the identity that I'd like to have? And in fact, we could even ask, like, the person who has that identity, what kind of habits would they have? And then we use that identity to inform the process, the habits, and we let the outcomes come naturally. And there are a variety of examples of this. Imagine you went up to two people and you said, hey, would you like a cigarette? And the first person says, oh, no, thanks, I'm trying to quit. And the second person says, oh, no, thanks, I'm not a smoker. Now, technically, they've done the same thing. They both turned down the cigarette. But the second person kind of has signaled a shift in identity change. Like the first person is trying to be something they're not. No thanks, I'm trying to quit. And the second person is saying, I'm not a smoker. It's just not something that I do. And I think once you get to that stage, that shift in identity, you're in a much more powerful place from a behavior change standpoint, because you're not even really trying to change anymore. You're just acting in alignment with the type of person you see yourself to be. So I like to divide a habit into 4 stages. And as you said, those 4 stages kind of have 4 different, what I call the 4 laws of behavior change that come out of it. But when I was working on Atomic Habits and researching this framework and trying to understand, like, why do behaviors happen and how do they happen, how do habits form, I had a couple questions that I felt like previous frameworks did not answer that well. And broadly speaking, those human models of human behavior tended to fall into one of 2 categories. The first category are what I would call like motivation models. So they explain things like internal drives and motivations and cravings and kind of like what compels us to act. And then the second category were what I would call reinforcement models. And so they described like the rewards that we get from behaviors and how those things kind of reinforce our behavior and essentially what happens like after an action. And what I wanted to do was try to come up with a model that I felt like accurately described both the motivation that may come before and the reinforcement that may come after, and how those things influence the actions that we take. And there were a variety of what I thought were fairly simple questions about human behavior that weren't totally answered by the previous models. So things like, what causes somebody to try a habit in the first place? Like you haven't experienced the reward at that point. So why would you take the first bite of a pancake or the first smoke of a cigarette? Like what would motivate you to do that? Habits are a cue, and then there's the action, and there's some kind of outcome. Well, how come 2 people respond differently to the same thing? Like why would one person see a cigarette and feel like, oh, I have to smoke, and another person's like, I've never smoked a day in my life, I'm not interested at all? Because if it's just the cue that leads to the action, you would think they would do the same thing. And even why would the same person respond differently to the same cue? How come when I walk in my kitchen at 7 a.m., I see a loaf of bread and I think, oh, I'm going to make some toast for breakfast. But then I walk in at 4 p.m. and I see that same cue and I don't think anything of it. I just move on. And for a long time, we thought it was about reward and satisfaction and enjoyment. But in fact, it seems that the crucial role dopamine plays is about prediction and anticipation. And so the first time that you take a bite of a pancake, you don't know what to expect. And so you take that bite, and then afterwards you get a surge of dopamine, almost as if to like mark the experience or to teach you, hey, that was favorable. You should do that again next time. Like if you happen to see a pancake again, that was a really great outcome. And so then the next time around, you know what to expect. And in fact, what we find is that dopamine tends to spike before you take a bite, not after. And there are a bunch of studies that show this, like, gamblers get a spike before they roll the dice, not after. Drug addicts get a spike before they take a hit of cocaine, not after. And so dopamine, I think probably the more accurate way to describe it in this context is it's a teaching molecule. It's a learning molecule, and it helps you, it helps mark experiences that are favorable so that you'll remember them next time. And then when you come across a similar situation, it spikes in anticipation. So after you see the cue, you get this craving, and it's actually that craving or anticipation or prediction that motivates you to act. And drives the response, and then there's an outcome. Addicts know that the behavior does not benefit their lives in a lot of ways, but they still can't get themselves to stop doing it, even though they know it doesn't benefit them. And I think part of the reason that happens, or perhaps the primary reason, is the drug kind of hacks the system. It gives you this spike of dopamine, even though you shouldn't be getting it. Usually your brain would not be doing that. It would not be trying to teach you to repeat that. But you're artificially spiking it by taking the substance. And so then, the process of learning breaks.